I'm Brendan Gormley. I have the pleasure and the awesome duty of keeping you all in order and getting us through what I think is going to be a really exciting afternoon. I know that this is a hugely important topic, and it's a really exciting moment where OCHA has shown, I think, real leadership in developing a policy framework for what I think is a new way of working. This is a jointly sponsored launch, an event. We have got GSMA kindly hosting us, very active in the mobile digital world. We also have OCHA here, and Imogen is going to lead on presenting the policy itself. And CDAC are pleased to be part of this launch, a network that works across a whole range of stakeholders trying to find new ways of working and developing new skills and resources. I think what we are hoping is that this event is actually modelling a different way of relating to a range of stakeholders. We have the UN system, we have the Red Cross, we have civil society, we have the private sector, and we have media, NGOs and media organisations. And the challenge is, how can we learn to work more effectively across those traditional silos? And I think that's what we're going to try and explore this afternoon. Our ambition is to change the humanitarian system, to put survivors of communities affected by disasters at the centre of our concerns, both before, during, and after a disaster. That's the vision. You are here to help us work through and turn that vision into reality. The challenge we're confronting is that this is all in a new reality, I think, as the report says, where information can be generated by anyone, shared with anyone, and acted on by anyone. That's the reality that we've got to be, not to be frightened by, and rise to the challenge. So I'm going to shut up. Imogen, over to you.
So, humanitarianism in the network age. What I'm going to do is we'll try and explain what we think this means. Why? Well, these are statistics strictly here at the GSMA. 9.3 billion mobile subscriptions worldwide. 3.3 billion smartphone connections. This is just in 5 years. This is Ericsson's projections. Eric Schmidt tweeted the other day, he's the chair of Google, saying that by 2020 everybody will be connected. This isn't just about phones, although it comes down to phones a lot because this is where connectivity is going to happen with the internet and increasingly with regular media as well. And there are whole populations who are going to skip the laptop tablet phase entirely and go straight to handheld devices. So really we'll stop talking about phones, start talking about handheld devices. What that means in practice, when we were writing the report, we focused on one case study in the end. This is a lady called Cassie Pajarillo. Cassie lives in the Philippines. She is 27. She's an events organizer. And in August of 2012 last year, when Manila flooded, her home street looked like this. And in one of those houses, her grandmother, who is disabled, very elderly, was trapped. And Cassie couldn't get back. She couldn't drive down the street. And she didn't have any way to get her grandmother out. So she tweeted. Now, note RescuePH, that was the government-designated hashtag for people who wanted to find rescuers in this particular crisis. So she went to Twitter. And Twitter is, I mean, the Philippines, Southeast Asia, in Jakarta particularly, it's huge. But this is really what we're looking at, I think. What the network age means in terms of people. It means a population who are increasingly able and capable of connecting to their own networks, of self-organisation, of self-reliance, and of being able to access sources of support from diasporas, from their own communities elsewhere in the country that are entirely outside the existing framework of humanitarian response. We did a thing online earlier, and people kept saying, we need to understand information, what information needs before a disaster. And I think actually that's one thing we probably don't need to do. If anything is staring us in the face at the moment, it's that information, communication is the #1 priority of people in a crisis. This picture is Kenya's. It's actually 5 years old, this picture. Studied by the World Bank last year and the iHub in Kenya, of the poorest of the poor, found that 1 in 4 people who they surveyed went without daily necessities in order to keep their phones charged. In Haiti, after the earthquake, some of you will know this figure. To charge your phone for 15 minutes cost $1. That's a day's income. We don't need to research the fact that people are prioritizing this. If you think about how much you earn in a day and think about spending that on 15 minutes of charge time for your phone, that tells you everything you need to know about priority on mobiles. In Sandy, it was the same. In the Philippines, when I was there, it was the same. So a phone is not just a phone. It's a radio, it's a way of filming things. It's also a job for a lot of people. Having said that, my colleagues in Internews did a very interesting piece of research where they looked at communications in the tsunami in Japan, one of the most technologically connected countries in the world. And this gentleman here, Hiroyuki, editor of his newspaper, Hibi Shimbun, in Ishinomaki, which was one of the most affected areas, for 6 days they were handwriting newspapers. That report also found that community radio stations were key because the other networks went down. So this is not, I think, about technology. We need to not make that mistake. This is about connectivity. It's about multi-platforms. It's about what people choose to use and are comfortable with in any given situation. And it's going to look a little bit different everywhere. This is not, as soon as you forget about people, you lose your thread in this whole new narrative. This is about people, communities, and trust. That's a newspaper. They pinned it outside shelters. Actually, when it went up, it was so popular people couldn't get to it. There were so many crowds around it. And we're seeing communities do all this for themselves. This is one of my favourite projects at the moment. This is Jalan Merapi project in Indonesia, which is a community network to run early warning and response around disasters that happen with the volcano, just outside Yogyakarta in the centre of Java. Now, you look at that top thing where it says 2006, Jalan Merapi started because the government-led response, face population assessment, broadcast of warnings, TV, radio, newspaper to the public was judged by the public to be completely inadequate. Journalists sensationalised the reports, the information came late or not at all. So 3 radio stations decided to set up their own network with volunteers, moved onto social media, found themselves organising a response. Now look at what happened in 2010 when the volcano erupted. See how much more complex and multi-platform that is, and how everything is moving in different directions all at once. That's what it looks like now. That's what it is. And that is also happening without any reference to us. Again, that is a completely community-led initiative. So this is what technology is enabling people to do. It's to do it all for themselves. There you are. And again, success not down to Twitter, down to the combination of all media use, and the direct, continued, and well-organised participation of people. Not, as I said, of us. What can we do with this as humanitarians? Well, part of the report, some of it is about communications aid, that's the focus here. A lot of it is also about how we collect, synthesize, manage, and fulfill as OCHA our role as providers of information to humanitarian community. This is something we did in the Philippines when I was there in December, Typhoon Bopa. This was the first ever OCHA map based on real-time collection, organisation, synthesis of damage, pictures and images generated through user-generated content. So this is pictures taken by the population themselves as a way of understanding what is happening on the ground in real time. It's obviously, as we said, Philippines, very socially media savvy country. Lots of clips going on YouTube, lots of pictures going on Twitter. The only way we could do that, because we haven't got a very big office and we are just OCHA, is because we had these guys. I'm deliberately showing you people, not the network. This is the guys behind the Digital Humanitarian Network. And yeah, they scraped Twitter and they scraped YouTube and they scraped Facebook and they sorted, verified, organised, mapped, and geolocated all that content in 36 hours using networks of people all around the globe. So this, for us, I think, illustrates a key point from the report. This is about partnerships. For a lot of us, we're not going to be able to do this in-house. We're going to have to use the networks and people who can, who are outside, and figure out how to work with them. So the findings of the HINA report: information is aid, communication is aid, increasingly connectivity is aid. And this is a cubing of where we are at the moment. This is, if connectivity is aid, how do we get the network back up? How do we think not just about how we talk to people and how we listen to people, but how we help them talk and listen to each other and connect with their networks? And it's nothing to do with us, actually, the information they're sharing. This is resilience. Resilience, self-organisation, depends on the capacity to connect. So increasingly, it's going to be impossible to talk about resilience without talking about this stuff. Embracing open data means that everything we do as humanitarians needs to be available to anyone who needs it, all the new actors, to the private sector, to governments in country, to affected populations. What does that mean for the platforms and the way that we organise data? Too much of it at the moment, we generate ourselves, we stick it in PDFs, we leave it in English, and we hide it on our systems by default. How do we change that? We need to invest in technical capacity, but also realise that this isn't just about us, very far from it. And we're never going to be able to do it alone. This is about really investing in partnerships with people like the GSMA, with the volunteer tech sector. And it is also about developing an ethical code around the use of data and information. We're seeing some quite frightening stuff in Syria right now, and we have very little at the moment in terms of guidelines around how, if you collect information from people in a crisis, how do you protect the identities of people who provided it? How do you store it? Who's responsible for it in the long term? How do we start to think about all of this? How do communities make those risk assessments themselves when they're giving us information? We need to think about this, and again, we need to talk to people in the private sector, particularly who have been working on this for a while in their own areas. So there you go, let's go back to Cassie. Well, her tweet was picked up by the daughter of a senator, actually, who forwarded it to a local hub of the police response team, who tweeted her back and said, there's a team just around the corner, we've asked them to come and get you. And so her grandmother was rescued and eventually taken away in that truck. Cassie's response, as appropriately in this Twitter age, was to take a picture of it and then to send that message, which I think is also quite a nice reminder this is a thank you. So, thank you very much, everyone, for coming.
Some of you may be familiar with the GSMA, and others may be wondering why, in fact, you're sitting in our office in the middle of London for this particular occasion. So just briefly, the GSMA is the Global Trade Association for the mobile industry. It represents over 800 mobile operators and 200 sort of associate members across over 200 countries, and that equates to roughly 2.3 billion subscribers, so that's actual people using phones in the developing world alone. Within the GSMA, we have a group called Mobile for Development, and that group works with development agencies and with mobile operators to develop sustainable services for the underserved in developing and emerging markets. And it's within that particular group that the Disaster Response Program sits. The Disaster Response Program is just over a year old, and it was really born from the belief that mobile and the communication and connectivity it enables are basic keystones of emergency response, of resilience, and of humanitarian aid. We also believe strongly that the mobile role has a very critical and growing role to play in this space. As the report highlights, this reality is being hardwired into the humanitarian system, whether it's welcomed or not, because end users are already using this technology and demanding that it's used increasingly. So it's significant that we're here for the launch of this report, not only because we are providing free wine and snacks to follow, but because of the shift that it symbolizes in the way that we understand how and what humanitarian assistance is provided and by whom. And that's really what is at the heart of this Humanitarianism in the Network Age report. Only a few short years ago, it would have been unfathomable that a private sector industry association for telecommunications companies would be hosting the launch of a humanitarian report. For too long, private sector actors and humanitarian agencies have viewed each other with mutual suspicion and distrust, perhaps believing that their aims and their motives were incompatible or mutually exclusive. What's become clear through witnessing the natural disasters and conflict that affected over 105 million people in 2012 alone is that those in crisis aren't particularly bothered by an agency's particular mandate or by whether assistance is being informed by a volunteer and technical community overseas, or whether in fact it's coming from a private sector company. What they care about is getting information, getting help, connecting with their loved ones, their communities, and with relief sources. Of course, challenges and differences exist between new and old actors at both the systemic and operational levels, but as the report so clearly points out, new, mutually beneficial partners and innovative approaches within and between these sectors is inevitable and critical if lives are to be saved and if the promise of these new technologies is to be fulfilled. So what does this mean for the mobile industry? Mobile network operators, you probably won't be surprised to learn, are often asked for short codes, for free SMS, for IVR systems, for access to the network. And we often get reports, unfortunately, that these requests lack coordination. They're not necessarily articulated clearly in terms of their intent and their timelines, and that there's an adequate understanding of the challenges that the mobile operators themselves face during these crises. This is not to mention the inundation and the added pressure and confusion caused by all of these humanitarian actors approaching operators in the immediate aftermath of a crisis. The reality is that when disaster strikes, mobile operators themselves are badly affected. They face infrastructural damage, network management problems. We've seen reports of power outages, of flooding, of congestion of the network across many different disasters over the past few years. And equally important is that they face human loss themselves, employees and their families being impacted or unaccounted for. As a result, most mobile operators feel both a corporate and moral obligation to provide assistance during crises, both through investments in network resilience and through the direct provision of aid to affected people who also happen to be their customers. At the core of their business, mobile operators provide an essential social utility through the communication and connectivity that they provide. They are there before disaster hits, they're there during, and they remain long after the last humanitarian agencies leave. One of the things I liked most about the report was the case studies, which highlighted how humanitarian agencies have been experimenting with new technologies. But I'm going to reflect a bit more now on how the mobile industry itself is adapting to its new and changing role in this space. The reality in the mobile industry, as within the humanitarian sector, is that there's a spectrum and a large variation in terms of internal capacity, investment, engagement, and approach to the communication as aid agenda. And this can also be confusing for humanitarian players. However, in recent years, promisingly, we've seen a significant amount of momentum behind the engagement of mobile operators in preparedness and response, with some companies going so far as to become seen as humanitarian aid providers in their own right. So some recent examples, we have a partnership between Digicel in Haiti and the Red Cross that's been ongoing since 2010 to provide emergency information to populations. Earthquake Van ushered in a turning point for the operator Turkcell, and they were recently cited by UNDP for their efforts to save lives, not only through the network, but through the provision of life-saving support. NTT Docomo in Japan, following the triple disaster, has begun rolling out over 100 large-scale, super resilient base stations to ensure that the network is more robust and able to withstand future disasters. They've also been developing and investing heavily in lots of innovative services like the disaster messaging service. We recently witnessed a very promising partnership and inter-industry cooperation between the operator Smart in the Philippines and the Vodafone Foundation to deliver communications to disaster-affected people after Typhoon Bopha. And just recently, the Orange France Telecom Data for Development Challenge closed, which provided CDR records and big data access to the humanitarian and development communities to see what could be done with that information. So lots happening. And as a basic, most of these operators are providing free calling and SMS, charging stations, person finder platforms, and other solutions that have been standard across their responses. Importantly, these services are designed not only to allow affected populations to be connected with humanitarian agencies, but as Imogen said, more importantly, to connect with each other. Many mobile operators go further still, leveraging their brands, their agent networks, and their resources to provide basic relief services, search and rescue capacity, run community preparedness drills, and send early warning systems. However, they cannot and should not be doing this alone and in isolation. As humanitarianism in the network age wisely points out, new technology, and mobile in particular, is not going to be a solution for all of the challenges that the humanitarian system faces. New opportunities like big data don't come without privacy and security challenges, and network resilience can be costly and a long-term proposition. Not least are the growing pains that are sure to accompany the new partnerships, new actors, and shifting power dynamics fueled by two-way communications that are so urgently needed. So I'd like to close with this photo that Imogen sent me. It's courtesy of Brian Sokol and UNHCR and appeared in Al Jazeera. And it's really stuck with me since she sent it to me 2 months ago, and I think it really summarizes why we're all in this room today. The caption reads, "Yusuf and his family fled their home several months before this photograph was taken. The most important thing he was able to bring from Syria is the mobile phone that he holds in this photograph. With this, I'm able to call my father. We're close enough to Syria here that I can catch signal from the Syrian towers sometimes. The photo also holds photographs of family members who are still in Syria, which he is able to keep with him at all times. So despite the challenges, we at the GSMA fundamentally believe that communication is aid, and that mobile network operators have more to offer in this space than just their networks. Better coordination, information sharing, and professional and complementary partnerships between the mobile industry and the humanitarian sector are needed now if we're truly going to embrace what humanitarianism in the network age can provide.
My role today is really just to give you a bit of an insight maybe into how a news organization manages what we call user-generated content, so content that is sent in directly to us from our audiences around the world, and also how we've been dealing with the challenges of very significant news stories over recent years, and how we've engaged on social media to try and tell the story in hopefully a more effective way. I'll give you a very brief sort of history of my team, the User-Generated Content Hub, which today is a team of about 20-odd producers that is embedded within the central bit of the BBC newsroom, and is a 24/7 operation, including bank holidays and weekends and Christmas Day, unfortunately. But one of the things that I think we have really learned is just how quickly this world around us has changed in terms of communication and technology. And you heard from the earlier two speakers just how significant some of this change is. But we started as a team 7 years ago, first week of July in 2005. And the plan really was just to have a team of about 3 producers that could work sort of Monday to Friday office hours, just to try and help the BBC more efficiently collate the content that we were being sent in from our audiences directly. So opinions of the stories of the day, occasionally emails with ideas for stories or potential interesting personal case studies of stories that we were covering. And then a week into the team being set up, the July 7 bombings happened. And that became the first example of a major story being led by our audiences. This was actually the first picture that our team received from a member of the audience. It happened to be a doctor who was working close by at Tavistock Square and saw this scene and took a picture and sent it in to us. At the time that this picture was received, the BBC was still reporting a power surge on the London Underground. So this picture, as you can imagine, dramatically changed our understanding of what exactly this story was about. And it wasn't just that the various stations were closed because there was a power surge, but this was clearly a very different sort of story than what we were expecting to tell. And then that dramatically changed, you know, how that story unfolded. And you will remember, I'm sure, that over that preceding sort of 24 hours, all the images were predominantly dominated by ordinary people who were travelling on the tube that day or at Tavistock Square, taking mobile phone pictures, sending them in or giving them to correspondents who then later went to the scene. It taught us the audience knew more than us on this story, and actually it's true for every story that we've subsequently discovered. They helped us tell the story faster, and they helped us tell the story better. Now, these 3 things today are very sort of self-evident and obvious, but actually it was quite revelatory for a news organization as recently as 7 years ago. But these 3 very basic principles really inform every aspect of our journalism today. Another story that was very significant for us, again in terms of audience-led sort of storytelling, was the Burma Reprising that came a couple of years later. And the reason why this was so significant was it was the first story in the sort of social media age, which we had to cover without any presence on the ground, because the BBC, like many other news organisations, were banned from having a presence inside Burma. So we had no producers, no reporters, no cameramen, no one on the ground. And so how do you tell this story? And it was because we had people who are expats or British holidaymakers in Burma at the time. They initially started sending us emails and sending us some pictures and sending us some information about what was going on. We then looked at this new thing called Facebook and Twitter at the time and thinking, do you think there's anything we can do with this this website. And we asked around, and there was no one else in the BBC newsroom who was doing anything with Facebook or with Twitter. And so we took it upon ourselves to, well, let's see what's out there. And we very quickly found Burma groups who were engaging on Facebook, finding people who were on the ground. Some had managed to make communication with them, and were also surfacing information, intelligence, pictures, very occasionally videos. And we got in touch with a lot of the administrators of these Facebook pages and built up relationships and built up a way of authenticating content through these channels in a much quicker way. And then since then, a number of other stories have come along, including the Iranian uprising and protests. And then, of course, was the Arab Spring, which for the last 2 years has been a story which has revolutionized in many ways. People on the ground can help tell stories and potentially lead stories. On the left is just an example of our Arab Uprising special page on our website, which is currently filled predominantly with our own teams on the ground and their reports and their analysis. On the right is a YouTube channel by one of the main Syrian activist groups called Sham SNN. Now, this YouTube channel, every day, there are scores of videos that get uploaded. And we very quickly, quite early on, managed to get a sense of these sorts of channels and just how useful they potentially could be in terms of getting video or getting information about stories that we didn't have a presence on the ground and couldn't cover. We had to go through our own sense of sort of assessment analysis about how reliable these groups were and what do the videos really show us. And again, this was where we had to rethink the way we use our own resources in the organisation. I think it's something that I'm sure may well resonate with a number of people in this room in terms of your own organisations. The Arab Spring really forced the collapse of BBC News silos. Things like BBC website, BBC radio, BBC TV, programs like Newsnight, Panorama, Today programme, as well as the World Service language services, they all very much operated in silos and did their own things, pretty much in isolation based on their own programme agendas. But we realised that actually there's a huge amount of expertise and talent here if we can try and bring them together to really try and help benefit BBC News as a whole. And so we began having much more closer relationships with BBC Arabic and also BBC Monitoring, because many of them had producers who had expertise of specific location. We managed to get a BBC Monitoring producer who was from Libya embedded in our team for a few weeks. Because he was from Libya, he could tell us, well, actually, this mosque, you don't get architecture of mosques like this in Benghazi. You only get them in Tripoli or somewhere else. And that's a level of intelligence or information that we can't match just through our own technical analysis. And so it's this sort of additional information and expertise that we try to pull together, which had a really significant impact in the way that we were reporting. And so this is just additional contextual analysis that we often use. And so whilst there are still technical analysis that we can put into videos, a lot of it is just common sense and bringing in expertise that can be really, really useful. But just one final thing which I think is really revolutionizing the way we source content, and I think has a lot of value to what you guys all do, and it's mentioned in terms of the mobile phone sort of presentation earlier, is that as increasingly mobile devices get smarter and geolocation is automatically switched on, it's much easier to actually track where people are uploading content from. And this is just an example of some of the images we managed to capture using a particular service called Geophedia of Boston minutes after the bombing that happened there a couple of weeks ago. This is content that we would never have found so quickly previously, and it's because of technology like this that is helping us to retell the way we tell stories, but also be much more accurate in the way we tell stories. So I will stop there because my time is up.
I'm going to be talking, I guess, from the perspective of somebody who is a victim or somebody who has been on the other side of many of your efforts. And also, to reiterate the point about communications and connectivity, but also how sometimes as people who have been on the other side, we sometimes find ourselves being kind of junior partners in our own experience, and why, although we welcome the importance of storytelling, why sometimes we distrust the kind of, the authority voice who's at the center, communicating what the reality is. So I'll tell my own humanitarian story. I was born in Nigeria as a young boy. I lived through the Civil War. Many of you, when you see Africans, you sometimes only see us when our worlds are broken. Mine broke in the 1960s during the Biafran conflict, with its bloated, malnourished and starving children. In many ways, Biafra defined how aid agencies and other humanitarians respond to an international crisis. Indeed, we know that Doctors Without Borders was born then, and a lot of lessons and a lot of models grew out of Biafra. My perceptions of that war, it was terrible. It was, everybody suffered. There was a lot of death. Mostly the families who were on the receiving end of that lost family members. My father died in that war, and a much loved uncle. So our worlds were upended. And yet, the most interesting thing was the war years, certainly before my father's death, remained some of the happiest. I mean, it's very strange, it's a contradiction. Some of the happiest and most intense experiences of my life. During the war, people lived intensely. They loved intensely and looked after each other intensely. A lot of social capital, what I would call the total society. Everything, the individual agency was paramount. Biafra, for those who were not aware, was blockaded. And so we had to basically turn to our own agency. We manufactured soap, my family, we did that. Weapons, all along. We looked after the wounded, the vulnerable. And I saw my elders, people who I respected, doing this on a day-to-day basis. Incredible solidarity. And ordinary people became extraordinarily heroic. There was a bomb that fell about 200 yards from us, and the response to that was incredible. Throughout that war, I saw one white person, a Catholic priest. And this is important because my father is a senior civil servant, and towards the end of the war, his job was actually to look after the refugees that were displaced from other parts of Biafra, because as you can imagine, the Nigerian army was encroaching rapidly, and the area we occupied was shrinking. So in the early days of the war, there were huge atrocities committed, and people thought that if they stayed, they would be victims of genocide. So people ran towards this contracting area. So there were huge numbers of displaced people, and part of my father's job was to look after them. So we did that, and aid came in. We knew that was coming in because we received the packages, but the people who did the work was us, and 90% perhaps of that happened there. And we communicated through networks, and we talked about connectivity here, we talked about the importance of networks, and in those days it was word of mouth, but also Radio Biafra was very important about how this happened. And I knew as a kid, because the radio was always on, and much of it was propaganda, but also there were other things going on it. So, a few years later, I leave Nigeria, and I'm in England, and I'm 5 years or so after the war. There's a program, a current affairs program, marking the anniversary of the war and how people were recovering and the reconstruction. And two things struck me about that current affairs program. The first was that I heard, obviously, some of my relatives talking, and I heard Igbo for the first time on television, which was quite extraordinary. And the second thing that happened was that I watched this report, and I was shocked that what I had gone through was not what was on the screen. And the story became about the humanitarian agencies, it became about oil, it became about, I don't know, our inventiveness, our agency, how we looked after each other. It was not reflected in any of it. In fact, the story was not about us. One of the key issues that came out of this, it changed my life. I wanted to begin to tell the story from the other side, because I just felt that story wasn't being told. African agency became a real kind of issue for me, and how we tell that story became very important, and an understanding of the way that ordinary people respond to crisis, and the way that it's basically marginalised in the way that we tell the story. So over the years, what has happened and what has been very exciting is the advent of new technologies and information and transmission platforms, mobile telephony, as we've heard, and others, money transfer systems. Africans and other poor people around the world, who are, I'm sure would reflect many of the things I've been saying, are now not so reliant on those dominant platforms or the ability of agencies like the BBC to authorise what is a version of the story that we should be listening to. And I work for the BBC, so I know I'm not totally critical of it. I think it serves a so useful role, but I don't think it should be the authority on how we understand the world. And the story of the agency of the African diaspora, like my own story, is a huge iceberg which has been hidden, it's been buried by Western communication platforms, but we haven't been relying on those platforms to get the job done. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the work that we do at Ford and about the diaspora itself. Ford was set up in '94, and part of the reason was that it was this question of being a junior partner in your experience. Before Michael Burke, if you'd gone on TV and talked about people about African development, most of the time Africans would be the ones explaining their own problems. By mid-1990s, if you turn on the TV, a model that, after Band-Aid, that was supposed to empower us, had so disempowered us that we weren't able any longer to even articulate our own issues, because it would invariably provide aid development worker explaining what was going on in Africa. So we were concerned about this, and the other thing we were concerned about was that there was a crisis in Sierra Leone, it was on fire, Sierra Leoneans here were responding, and it was almost a parallel world where they had the skills to understand what was going on in terms of language, in terms of the church, the story you told about the church, and the aid world was going on in another parallel world, and this seemed to make complete nonsense, and there should be room for working together. Diaspora is considered the sixth region of Africa, 6 forms of capital we think that they harness to do development in Africa, financial, over 60 billion informally through remittances, huge amount, dwarfs overseas development aid to Africa. When ODN, foreign direct investment, is cautious about coming in, remittances actually come in because of central capital, because people are concerned about their relatives. When there is a crisis, the diaspora are sometimes the first to get in. And they send money for relief, they're involved in reconstruction, and then later on they invest in the jobs, create, particularly when others are very cautious to reinvest. Mobile telephony now has offered the possibility of engaging directly in media, conflict resolution, and you can see that when Kenya exploded, a lot of the diaspora were very involved using social media to try and map what was going on the ground in terms of the violence, but also to encourage and create spaces online, blogging, to mediate and bring all of that down. So in terms of the conclusion, we are very important stakeholders in terms of money. We are the biggest aid donors, in inverted commas, to Africa. And I welcome this forum so that we can talk about ways that the work that we're doing can be synergized with the work that you're doing, and we can have a proper discussion. I'm sorry I wasn't able to go through in detail, but I think you get the gist. Thanks.
I'm the coordinator of HIFA 2015, which stands for Health Information for All by 2015. And my question is about the availability of first aid information and other kind of essential healthcare knowledge and other types of emergency information that you might have actually preloaded onto mobile phones even without requiring a connection.
Sure. So I think there are existing content development modules that are sort of geared towards what you're mentioning in terms of emergency or first aid health information. I believe there's an organization called Medic Mobile that does provide those kinds of modules, and as well, I believe that InfoAid through their content platform has pre-existing health information that can be accessed both by the humanitarian system and by end users themselves. One of the challenges for operators in terms of mobile health services is not necessarily the connectivity that you identified, but that at the heart of it, they're not healthcare experts and content developers in and of themselves. So they need the expertise from the humanitarian community, from the health organizations to develop that content so that it is available. And one of the things that our mobile health team, the Mobile for Development group, is working on at the moment is an engagement guideline between the World Health Organization and mobile operators to help generate some of that content and make it more readily available for end users.
Miranda, who's over there, who is the brains behind the InfoSafe project that Kyla mentioned, which is this global platform of pre-approved, is the right word, content across all sectors, not just medical. It's gone through all the cluster systems so that the words you can say about it is it's all safe, it's all usable. The idea that you could do this without connectivity is something that might interest my colleague Laura, who I can't immediately see, who's the head of Frontline SMS, which is specialised in developing technology that works offline, works without connectivity.
Well, I think you said most of it already, but just to say a little bit more, because I think the importance is the localization. At the moment, the message library has nearly 400 messages for 7 key sectors, so it's health, nutrition, WASH, education, food security, camp coordination, camp management, etc. There are 7. But the idea is to use that message library as a sort of reference to generate localized messages in local languages, contextualized, pilot tested, ready for kind of dissemination. And the first test we're doing is in Bangladesh, and I will be going for a month on Sunday to roll out the localization. And then the Philippines will be the next country that will also roll it out in the kind of Philippines context.
I'm Laura from Frontline SMS. I would say, actually, possibly controversially, that what strikes me, so Frontline SMS lets you send, receive and manage SMS whether you're online or not. So you can use it without the internet, you just need to have a connection to the mobile network. And what I think is one of the things that has come out a bit, but that I'm always struck by in these discussions, is that this isn't just about how the large humanitarian, the international responders, or even how governments can use technology to respond to emergencies and to communicate with communities. And it's also about how communities can communicate with each other, as was said, but also how local first responders, the people who are there in the first 24 hours, can use these technologies to respond to emergencies. And we saw in the Philippines this is happening already. So I think we have to recognize that when we're investing in platforms and looking at data sets, that we are investing in it not only for ourselves, but also for the people who could really do with easily accessible, locally appropriate resources and tools to help them do what they need to do in an emergency.
Hi, my name is Nadia. I'm a student, a master's student at Oxford Brookes University, and the communication technologies is going to be my research dissertation this summer. I'm just wondering how, do you think the agencies are fully equipped to deal and manage that amount of information that is coming from the communities, and how much focus an agency should put on monitoring Facebook, Twitter, and all these feeds rather than doing their own needs assessment?
Early days, sorry, Madara Hechirichi with World Vision. I lead humanitarian accountability for the organization. In the early days, it's a plethora of information coming from our communities, and it's something that it's trial and error. We've done some pilot projects with InfoSafe, with Frontline SMS, trying to see what that looks like. But we're building capacity as we're responding. And we've got a technology project currently underway working with Ushahidi, Frontline SMS, and a group called SMAP. And this is what we're trying to do. During preparedness times, test it out, work with the community, see if it's appropriate technology, and then keep building it and see, hopefully we can deploy it in a response. But yeah, we're all still learning.
Thanks. Greg Barrett from the World Food Programme. I think it's a really interesting question. It drives really to the heart of where we are in this. I think the capacity is there, but I think one of the really challenging things is identifying which part of the organisation has the expertise to actually really analyse this data and make it useful in a programmatic sense. And certainly, I think one of the issues at WFP, and I'd be interested to hear from other agencies, is where does that responsibility lie? Who is meant to take this information and use it to kind of refine and fine-tune the response, really hear the feedback from the beneficiaries and deliver on what they're saying? And I think that's a really, really challenging thing for all of us.
Yeah, for many people in my organisation, that's the question. I think you get sucked into debate about what is meaningful and what is white noise, which for me I dislike, because I think that so this is information coming from all sorts of places all the time. Everybody who sends something does it for a reason. So the idea that, if we say deciding what is meaningful and what isn't, that is our judgment. What we're maybe looking for situational awareness or very specific, very technical things, but that doesn't mean that everything else that is happening is white noise. And for me, this is one reason why the focus on communities connecting with each other is as important, because if they can organise their own response, then our caseload diminishes. Actually, it is one of the practical implications. My colleagues at FEMA, who spoke at our launch last week in New York, found that if they provided connectivity to very poor immigrant groups in the Rockaways and in Red Hook, that those communities then became so able to connect with other people across America and across the world, that actually the humanitarian caseload diminished. So I think we need to think of the cost benefit in those terms. We're never going to be able to do this on our own. We just aren't. We are never going to have the kind of armies of people, of expertise that you can have from the crowd, frankly. And this is, to be honest, part of the appeal for humanitarians of crowdsourcing. Is it's a way to tap into people across the world who have very specific knowledges of language, knowledges of places. Very small example, in Haiti, when we were trying to figure out where things were going on the ground in real time, streets didn't have names. People said things like the corner where the supermarket used to be 10 years ago in Creole. And you had to be, someone else would say, the corner where the post office used to be 5 years ago. And actually it was the same place. These things are incredibly culturally and socially embedded. So it's not a question of technical expertise as much as it is cultural and context-specific expertise. James C. Scott is very, very good on this. So you're never going to be able to build the capacity in-house. It's always going to have to come from the crowd if you're trying to get down to that level. And we have to stop trying to control it as well. I totally agree with what you were saying. We are so desperate to, what we actually mean sometimes by information management is generating a single narrative of what is going on. And that is what we are fundamentally unable to do anymore.
Thanks. I was just going to say that, I think the danger in trying to create a single narrative or channel it through one place is that people will just avoid that. Part of the reason these other networks work is that that's what they want. And for me, the technology is offering these multiple possibilities. I mean, the woman who was rescued in your clip was rescued by other people in the community. She didn't need to go through, a body to analyze the data and make out what was the best way to solve this. People do that every day in their lives. And if you try and channel it through one source, they'll just bypass it. The reasons that the diaspora do development the way that they do is that they were avoiding three different groups of people. They were avoiding the aid agencies, they were avoiding the governments here, and they were avoiding the governments there, because they didn't trust the three of them. And if you're trying to get them to work through you, they'll just find another channel, because there is something fundamental about the model that they don't like. And the level of accountability is to people that they know, and they can get a report the next day. They don't have to have a four-wheel drive to put a well in the village.
We're very used for many decades. We've controlled the narrative. But I don't think we can anymore, can we?
No, I think these organisations have learned pretty quickly now that they're not fountains of knowledge and wisdom, but increasingly they're becoming almost like curators and filters themselves, hoping to provide their sort of journalistic, editorial analysis on stories, but increasingly the source of this material and the source of this information is coming from ordinary people anywhere in the world. And so I think one of the things that we've very much had to learn, as Imogen is saying, is change is going to happen regardless of whether we build a strategy around it or not. Thankfully, I think we sort of pretty much have, but you know, it's always a question of running faster than you can to try and keep up. But I think one of the things that my team have always really found so useful is understanding how people behave in different parts of the world and use different technologies in different ways. And so, for example, in Africa, where text messaging is so important and vital, you know, it's very different to the way, you know, people in Boston behaved with their phones, or use, you know, particular types of social media. And that again is different to China, where very few people use Twitter or Facebook, but they use Renren and other services that, you know, I've never heard of until quite recently. And so, my advice has always been to our sort of regional bureaus is, you know, don't worry about feeling that you have to learn Twitter or you have to learn YouTube or Facebook, but understand how people in your areas use these technologies and just become familiar with those. Because it might be that you can, you know, create a really nice, shiny Twitter strategy, but actually the audience that you're aiming at don't use Twitter, but they use something else. And it might be, you know, using typewriters, who knows, but, you know, focus on the technologies that they actually use, and that's where you get your greatest efficiency.
Certainly putting my CDAC hat on and having gone around a lot of the network members over the last couple of months, my sense is that they've got it, but it's quite sort of fragmented inside the different agencies, who owns it, who are the champions, and the culture change that this demands is still not there, even if there are individuals or departments that have got it. It's still very fragmented. That's how it came across to me.
My question is about for the sort of broader needs of the sector around, you know, use of big data, use of lots of information. Who's best to lead on the development of this kind of guidance? Where should that come from? And is, in that space, there room for a moderator of some sort? Is that something that's needed?
As you leave, you'll see a document called Towards a Code of Conduct for the use of SMS in natural disasters, and that's something that we published in March of this year. And having had that experience, just a few reflections that I can offer that may help inform your own. It was a difficult decision and we weren't necessarily sure that we were the right organization to take on this kind of document. And what it really was the product of is several years of conversation online that was taking place in Google Documents, on Twitter, fed into by probably most of the people in this room coming out of Haiti about how SMS should be used in these kinds of circumstances. But what hadn't happened was actually aggregating that information, doing kind of in-depth interviews, putting it all together and making it available. So we worked with Patrick Meyer and the Qatar Foundation and an organization called Sukatel to drive that process and actually produce something that could then be a resource that documented all of the conversations and the expertise that had been happening online, but that had sort of reached a standstill in terms of making it into something meaningful.
It seems that you have sort of potentially three things that flow through a network. You have information, you can have money, and you can have offers of help. And I'm wondering if there's a space for humanitarian agencies in that sort of new environment.
Spaces. So, I mean, I think the model is going to be a decentralized one. We see what's happening with information. It's much more, you know, democratic. It's, you know, cost of entry is much lower. And I think the same thing will happen. I think what the aid agencies can do going forward is to be, and even the big broadcasters who are in charge of communications, is to be facilitators. Some of the great things that the BBC can do is to train people in communities so that they can be sending the information and understand some of the ethical issues that everybody here is concerned about, and we're concerned about as well. But essentially those people will be documenting their own communities, and they can send the pictures through to those who have the power to channel it or transmit it around the world. I think if you look at what's happening with the aid agencies in some other respects. And I know that what Oxfam and others have begun doing is actually sort of removing themselves from planning huge projects, and some of the more interesting things that they're doing is that decentralization model where you give somebody a cash transfer and let them get on with it. They know best what they want to do in their lives, and the agencies have to trust people to run their lives, which is what we do here. The most important thing you can do in most people's lives is to give them a job. And once you give them a job, they will make the decisions about where they want to send their kids to school, build a well, and all those decisions they make themselves. The job is the important thing if we really want to talk about that poverty reduction. And the most important thing you can then do after that is what we do here once people have a job, is that you nudge them to make good decisions about their lives. And for me, it's that advisory role, but let people get on with running their lives and not kind of planning projects that will control that. Give them the money and let them do what they want to do with that, and find a system for making, obviously it's public money, find a system for making sure that it's accountable, that it's tracked and everything else, but essentially let them make their decisions about how they want to develop.
I can just think of one example where you're talking about a facilitating role that agencies may have. When Hurricane Katrina struck, I remember that there was the story of one particular person who just set up a web page allowing people who had lost relatives to just post up if they'd lost contact with people and just put their name and address and their phone number that they were at now. And it suddenly got picked up tremendously, and everyone just started using this page, and the US government had their own sort of official website that they were trying to do the same thing, but quickly realized that actually this personal website was being far more effective, and then rather than trying to compete with it, they just started pointing people to that website itself. And that's just one example of the way that maybe aid agencies' work could develop in the future.
But I always think of this kind of comparison when I think of the future of the humanitarian system in this context, and it's sort of a cautionary tale from the music industry of all places. And if we think back to what happened with Napster and the rise of iTunes, music companies, as we know them, were disintermediated. They didn't get on the boat, and the boat sailed off without them because the people had the power. And I think that there are two ways that this is going to go, and one of them is in the way that we're seeing the music industry having evolved. And I think most people in this room probably don't see that as being the preferable outcome. So I think that really takes us back to the real theme of the report, that these changes are happening. Communication is at the center of it, and we all need to adapt and work better to capitalize on that.
If connectivity can be a priority now, could it also become perhaps a target in future years?
So in what essence are you trying to come into Africa to build the super technology of probably sat-nav to operate, even when there's no mast there and there's disaster, we could still connect?
With regards to connectivity itself and communication itself becoming targeted, we saw in Nigeria in September that lots of the mobile network infrastructure was targeted and disrupted. So that is a reality, and it need not only be by natural disasters. There are lots of man-made interferences that can disrupt the network. I think in terms of sort of super connectivity and ways of working around that, I don't think that anyone has an in-the-box solution that can be rolled out to solve that problem. There are increasing investments made in sort of subterranean cables and other kinds of really technical things that can help. But I think the fact that the mobile network is being targeted really speaks to the fact that perhaps actors with more malicious intents do recognize the value that it has to both citizens and to governments and to the communication that they rely on. And I think that's really symbolic in terms of how it is being seen as, we used to see food corridors blockaded, now we're seeing mobile networks interrupted. And what does that say about how these information sources and communication sources are being used?
We worry about how we manage data. What actually matters is whether or not the people who are inputting that data trust that process. We know nothing, almost, about the trust processes, the risk decisions that communities make when they are giving us information. And we've seen people killed for giving us information with paper needs assessments. So again, how much of this is actually old wine, new bottles? I think technology has changed, people have not. Many of these are actually problems with which other people have been wrestling for years. I think that also speaks to connectivity as a target. I used to work at the BBC as well when I started in '99, right at the end of the Northern Ireland conflict. The Northern Ireland newsroom, as a matter of routine, used to get phoned up by the IRA. It was the classic way for the IRA to place a bomb warning. They did it through the media. I know that when I trained at the BBC, they taught us how to handle terrorists taking hostages and calling up the BBC, and the price for the hostage being released being a message read out on the BBC. This has all been standard within the World Service for a long time. Again, you know, we need to, I think a key message of the report is the need to reach out to other sectors and learn from other people and not pretend that our problems are just ours and that other people don't have solutions, because they really do.
One of the best things about these sessions is that you will be able to talk amongst yourselves the next 45 minutes, and please make yourself known to each other. CDAC network is there if there are things that you want to take up and be put in contact with people. I think a big round of applause. It's been a fantastic.